This week has been kind of a roller coaster of a week for a pastor, and also, I would say, for our church family. It kind of started with, the normal ministry stuff that all comes across our desk pretty much Monday morning, even though Mondays are my day off, and then Tuesday comes around and we kind of meet together for the first time in staff. We kind of deal with all of these things that are happening that we just need to figure out. And then Wednesday, we actually had a wedding. And so we had planned for that, been working on that. And Edwin and Emily Quintero, congratulations, they're here today. And so we are so proud of them. And it was going to be like kind of this smaller family thing. And then before you knew it, Emily decided to invite her small group. And then Edwin's like, well, hey, let's just invite the whole church. And so we just kind of put a little post out there on Facebook. And thank you to those who came out to celebrate with them as they are now married. And we're just so happy for them. And I want to continue to invest in their life together. And we're grateful that they're investing in our church. And so that was kind of Wednesday. And then Saturday came around, and our church kind of hosted a celebration of life service for a good friend of many of you who grew up in our church named John Pangarelius, who was only 32 years old. John attended our youth group that we affectionately called at the time Code Blue. I was the youth pastor then for 17 years during that time, and we had an amazing group of students during those 17 years, and again, we referred to ourselves as the Code Blue Student Ministries. Several years ago, it seems like John had entered a very dark time within his life, and through that dark time began going down a kind of a path that was not a good path. And on that path, you could say that he entered into a spiritual battle that was so real and so heavy that he could not fight. And we shared just yesterday in the service that the enemy is a liar. And the enemy will breathe lies into your ears until you believe it. And John, in a moment of weakness, was listening to those lies, and John ended his life at 32 years of age. But what Satan has intended for evil, I believe God always has the last word. And God has used this tragedy that has ripped a family, we can only imagine. And this family is remaining so strong in their faith that they're teaching me. But God is using this tragedy in such a way that he has a way of turning things inside out and bringing beauty. Right? And so our students during that 17 years of Code Blue student ministry decided to all come into town. We're still trying to figure out how many of those students were here. There was quite a crowd, maybe 200 or so. And then we had probably close to 50 of those students from that era who knew John, who grew up with John, who worshiped with John, who studied scriptures with John, who were in small groups with John, who did all of those things together. They came in, and it was like a reunion. We couldn't believe it. It's like my wife and I just last night, we were kind of processing some of this, what was going on, and we was like, everywhere we turned, we're like, I know that kid who's now 32 years old, right? I know that girl who's now 30 years old and looks like a woman. I mean, what in the world is going on? And it was the strangest event. We're still trying to wrap our heads around this. I was talking with Pastor Mark, and we were just kind of reminiscing about it just a few minutes ago before the service. And we're like, wow, it's just so wild. We were just talking about all these students that we knew during that period of time who we had an opportunity to kind of pour into. And it was amazing. And the stories that we're hearing is that there's some of these stories that are coming in. I talked with one student afterwards, no longer a student, but he's an adult. And I need to tell you that the family decided to give me permission to share a little bit about the news of what happened in John's life. There's a stigma when it comes to suicide that often when it's hidden and covered, it doesn't help other people who are maybe going through very similar dark times. I talked with one of these students afterwards. He came up and he's like, he goes, I can't believe this. It's like, that was me just like a few weeks ago. But somehow I was able to pull out of that dark time. He goes, thank you and thank the family for for sharing and helping the rest of us. And that was part of the purpose of what the family said, no, you need to be honest. We need to be honest and share about some of the hurt that John was experiencing to help others. Again, God turning things inside out and helping to bring healing to other students. There's one story of one of our students who's all the way across the country in another state who couldn't come, wanted to be here, just couldn't make it, watched on live stream. Her mom kind of reached out to me after that service and said, God is working in her child's life. No longer a child now, but God is working in her child's life. So God's using these things and these stories, something so tragic, to still bring about beauty. So it's been a busy week. So to say that I'm tired today is an understatement. To say that our team is tired is an understatement. They've been working nonstop, and I'm so thankful and proud to have staff and to have a praise team that are just willing to do anything. On our way to church today, the Pointer family had some very deep theological discussion. Jeremiah, again, Jeremiah, who joined us for the ride. And so like we always do Sunday morning, we ride together in the Toyota. And so we're kind of heading here in the SUV. And Jeremiah decides he's going to bring up a kind of a deep theological discussion. And so he just kind of throws out a question. And he says, hey, he goes, if you guys could have one superpower, what would it be? And so I'm just kind of going over my notes like I normally do on Sunday mornings. I don't drive. I let my wife drive on the way into church, and I'm just kind of trying to get things ready and get my heart ready and everything else. And so I was eavesdropping in on the conversation. My youngest, Cambry, spoke up, and she said, I would fly. That would be my superpower, is I would choose to fly. And so I'm just kind of listening. That's kind of cool, and that would be cool to fly. And then Jeremiah says to my wife, Miss Tandy, what would be your superpower of your choice? And she's like, I would like to be able to snap my fingers and go anywhere in the world in the blink of an eye, specifically for the purpose so that I could snap my fingers and go see my kids and grandkids at any moment of the day. That's just the heart of my wife. It's amazing how she says that, right? And so I just kept kind of going through my things. And then Jeremiah says, hey, Pastor Paul, what would be your superpower of choice? I'm like, I'm trying to focus, Jeremiah. I don't really want to know. So I said, I don't know, because I struggle. You guys know me. I struggle making decisions. It's just kind of a part of who I am. So I'm trying to think it through, like, would I really want to fly, or would I really want to do this? I don't know what I want to do. And so then my kids speak up in unison. We know what it would be, Dad, to produce a sermon in 2 minutes. True story. That just happened 2 hours ago, right? And so I'm like, yes, that would be my superpower, right? But unfortunately, by the way, I said there is a superpower, and it's called the Holy Spirit. And there are times I tell you that God shows up. I'm like, I got nothing, God, please help me. And it's certainly one of those days today. But I don't have superpowers. We hit a tough spot this week as a team. It's not just me. We hit this tough spot trying to work through this, and we're wiped out. So last night I went home after the service and just processing everything, just the weight of the whole week and just all of the stories and the people that we saw. And I decided that I was going to make a change a little bit in the direction I was going. And I need to be honest with you. Number one is I just wasn't prepared. And there's a passage that we're getting ready to hit right now. It's in 2 Timothy chapter 3, and it's like verse 16 and 17 that it's like, for me, over the last 2 weeks, it's been the verse of all verses. It's been the verse that I think is pivotal it's my opinion. There's a lot of other pivotal verses in 2 Timothy, but I think this is the one that it all lands on. And I want to make sure that I do justice to 16 and 17 because it's coming around the corner. And so last night I was just kind of saying, man, I don't feel ready for this mentally. I don't feel ready for this physically. I don't feel ready for this emotionally. That I got to change some things on a dime here and kind of figure out what we're going to do. And so I decided that we're only going to discuss these first 5 verses, right? So like 10 through 15 is what we got, right? And then the other verses we're going to have to cover within 2 weeks. Now you say, well, what about next week? And well, I need to tell you, and Mr. Gossett, I call him Mr. Gossett, Randy Gossett spilled the beans on me a couple weeks ago, and he said, I'm going on vacation. So you know that. Today officially begins our vacation. So after this service, I'm going to kind of dart out of here fast because my youngest gave me strict orders. Paul, yeah, she calls me Paul. No, she doesn't. She said, Dad, she says, you're not talking to anybody. you're out the door. So I have to do my best to help her, okay? And so that's the strict orders that I've been given. And so if I dart out of here quick, just know that I love you and I'll see you soon, okay? But next week we have a guest coming, Dan Rosenberg. He's a chaplain from Tampa Station in Tampa. You will be encouraged by Dan. It's Veterans Day. We're going to kind of spend some time honoring our vets. At the same time, Dan's going to share as a chaplain and what he's doing. It's just awesome. Young dude, young guy, and you will love Dan. So please, I'll be watching online, and hopefully you will be a part of that. So that's all what's going on. Now today, we shuffle it up a bit. Today we continue on in our Keep the Faith series, going through, again, if you're joining us for the first time, through the book of 2 Timothy. The Apostle Paul, by the way, I've been repeating these things every single Sunday because I want you to get them in their mind, because one day I'm going to do a pop quiz, okay? So the Apostle Paul is writing this. He's an older man, around the age of 60, and he's writing his final words, his last will and testament to this young guy named Timothy. Timothy, at this time in his life, is in ministry. He's a pastor of a church of Ephesus. Paul has been through the thick of it in every sense of the word, right? Timothy, in comparison, is just getting started in ministry. And Paul, an older guy, is speaking into a younger guy's life, and he's giving him this message: don't give up. Keep the faith. Stay strong. And so we've been reminding ourselves every single week that this is kind of what he's been telling us over and over and over. And then a couple of weeks ago, we kind of entered into chapter 3, and then the last section of chapter 2, Paul has been warning Timothy that there are terrible days, right? Terrible times are coming in these last days. If you want to know more specifics on what last days means, you can kind of find it on YouTube. That was last week, right? And so last days, we kind of learned that we're in the last days according to the Bible. And so this is it. Ever since Jesus, left the earth, we're in these final days. And so Paul is now warning Timothy, terrible things are going to happen in these last days. You better be ready. And then he specifically lands on this idea. He says there's destructive people and there's deceptive people that are going to come about, and they're going to try to weasel their way into your life, and they're going to try to speak lies into your head, and you better be alert and you better be prepared. And then he called them false teachers. Remember that? So again, Paul teaching to a kind of a younger pastor who has a flock of people that he's trying to care for. And so that was kind of last week. And Paul's saying, Timothy, if you're going to keep the faith, you're going to need a firm foundation if you are going to be able to endure the difficulties that are about to happen. So Paul urges Timothy to stay vigilant, to stay steadfast in his commitment, to stay strong. And in a powerful contrast here in these first kind of opening verses, he's going to contrast these false teachers that he's talked about. He gave us a lot of specifics about their life. Remember that last week. And then he's going to compare that with his own life. And so he's going to talk about how they were deceptive, how they were destructive. He's going to compare it with their own life. And he's going to provide Timothy with two essential directives. And we're only going to really look at one, and the second one we're going to just barely touch the surface on. And so we're going to look at some of these directives that Paul is telling Timothy. This is how you can remain strong. You need to continue in the teachings that I have given you, in comparison to the teachings of the false teachers, right? So that's kind of, again, how he's doing this. And so he's like, you've got to do this. And then the second directive he's going to say is, you have to be able to remain grounded in the unchanging truths of God's word. And that's going to be 16 and 17, which we're going to come back to that in a couple of weeks, and hopefully you'll be here for that. But now, in the meantime, let's pick up in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 10 through 15. We're going to read the whole passage kind of together, and then we'll spend some time in this section. You, however, speaking to Timothy, and I think he's also speaking to us, however, know all about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, faith, patience, love, endurance, persecution, sufferings, what kinds of things happened to me in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra, the persecutions I endured, yet the Lord rescued me from all of them. In fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted, while evildoers and impostors will go from bad to worse. That's the false teachers that he's been talking about. They're going to get worse. Deceiving and being deceived. But as for you, young Timothy, continue in what you have learned and have been convinced of, because you know those from whom you learned it, and how from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. So Paul, again, you got to remember last week, in comparing himself with these false teachers and their way of doing life. And Paul's speaking into Timothy's life saying, but this is how you need to be doing life. Think of my example. Think of my life. Think of the things that we have been through and how you've observed the faithfulness within me. So then Paul leads Timothy in what I learned this week that one commentary says, and I'm a word guy, and so I was kind of stunned by these words. I just like them. They're just average words, but I do like them. And so the one commentator said this. He says that you have to remain faithful. And then Paul leads Timothy into this idea of remembrance and continuance. You got to remember in order to continue. Remembrance, continuance. If you're going to continue on keeping the faith, Timothy, you have to remember me. You have to remember the teachings that you've heard from me, and even the teachings you've heard from infancy. We'll get to that in a second. And you have to know my teaching. You have to, that you've personally witnessed my faithfulness, lived out. Now, based on that, continue to live strong in the faith. I'm learning that there's this powerful link between remembrance and continuance. Remembrance, continuance. Yesterday at the Celebration of Life service, it ended up being this grand reunion of students over the last 10 to 15 years who we've had an opportunity to know and to do life with. And I was so encouraged by one student who came up to me at the end and just kind of began to share. And he said this. He says, he goes, I want to tell you that you, and he was talking about me, and Rick, who plays acoustic, Rick was one of my side, we did everything together, and so it was Rick and I who kind of helped lead the ministry. There was a third guy, a part of that at a time as well, and so Rick and I really kind of poured our lives on these students. And so this student who I hadn't seen in a long time, he said, I want to tell you that it was you and Rick who were the most influential people in my life. Because you taught me so much. He goes, you helped me to remain strong. And then he kind of got fun, and he says, and you even taught me how to do real life tasks and the work with my hands. He said, every time I go to toe a nail in a 2x4, I think of you and Rick, because you taught me how to hold a hammer. You taught me how to toe a nail in. You see, we would invite this student in on all the times we do our big vacation school builds. You've seen the elaborate sets, and so we would drag some of these other students in because we wanted them to kind of get a taste for ministry, and so we would throw tools in their lap and teach them how to use these tools. In fact, this particular student, there was a time during Vacation Bible School, we said, you're going to help us reenact the story of the 4 guys who are going to get their paralyzed friend to Jesus. Remember that story in the Gospels? And they can't kind of get him in the front door, and so how do they do it? They bring him in through the ceiling. And so we took this kid at a time, and we literally lowered him in a mat from the ceiling with pulleys that we created. This kid never forgot that, right? And we didn't either. It was pretty awesome. Probably illegal, but it was awesome. And so he's now sharing this with me. You see, my friend is remembering those early formative years where he learned about Jesus and he grew in his faith. And what he's telling me, it's the remembrance that has fueled his continuance. You see it? I'm so proud of him today. He's faithfully married. He's raising his children well, and he's actively engaged in a church further north of Florida, and he's growing in his faith. You see, this is what the Apostle Paul is building for us here. He says, Timothy, you remember all the days? You remember my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, my faith, my patience. Remember the VBS builds together? Right? Remember when I handed you the hammer in ministry and we kind of did life together? And he's like, remember my example? I never gave up. There were times I certainly should have and could have, but I never gave up. I'm nearing the end of my race now, Timothy, and I need you to continue on. I read a commentary this week. It's called Guard the Good Deposit by Kent R. Hughes. He's a pastor and author, and he writes a commentary on 2 Timothy, and he's reflecting on this very thing in his life of ministry. He kind of takes a big chunk out of this chapter, and he just kind of rehearses over his life, and he shares personal stories of people that have brought him to where he is today in the faith. And it's just really fun to kind of read. And then he says this, so he kind of prefaces all of that. And then he says this, he says, over the years, these remembrances have fueled my continuance in the gospel. That's where I got the words. I love them. There is a powerful link between remembrance and continuance. Such connections are part of God's way of working in our lives. Many older Christians are informed and sustained by similar remembrances, some which extend back many years. Certain names and events, like Vacation Bible School, right, from their spiritually formative years, regularly surface in their conversations. Similarly, the memories of youth pastors and their staffs will stand disproportionately tall in many lives for the next 50 or 60 years, beckoning continuance in the gospel. Paul now is continuing on this theme of remembering, and he begins now to share three specific areas where Paul kind of brings up, I think, a story for Timothy to remind him of those good days, right? To remind him of some specific events that I think Timothy was fully aware of, and that's why Paul chose to mention these three areas. Notice what he says in verse 10 and 11. You, however, know all about my teaching. Remember, you know what I've taught you. You know my faithfulness, my way of life, my purpose, faith, patience, love, endurance, persecutions, sufferings. And then he gets specific. What kinds of things happened to me in, here's the three places, Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra, and the persecutions I endured. And I forgot to put it on here, but then the rest of the verse says, yet the Lord rescued me from them all, right? He rescued me from them all. Paul could have recalled many other instances that Timothy may have observed or stories that Timothy had heard of, but Paul chooses those three. Paul could have chose Philippi when he was imprisoned in Philippi. I've been there and actually seen where we believe Paul was in prison there in Philippi when he first arrived. I've seen it. You can kind of look in Acts 16 for story. Or maybe Paul could have shared what happened to him in Ephesus. See 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Or maybe what happened to Paul in Rome. See Philippians 1. But instead, Paul chose to appeal to, I think, the sufferings surrounding Timothy's birthplace. I think those three places, Lystra, of course, where he was born, but I think all of them kind of revolve around Timothy, his home region, his origin, where he's from. And I think Paul was focusing on those particular sufferings that I also think had left an indelible impression on young Timothy. To the point so that if Timothy would have showed up at Paul's funeral, he would have told his friends, yeah, I remember that day when Paul literally almost got beat to death, right? Remember they dragged him out of the city? You guys remember that? They dragged him out of the city, and everybody thought he was dead, and they laid him on the ground, and then his left eye popped open. And then remember that story? Then he got up, he dusted himself off. You guys remember that? And I think that's probably what would have happened. And so Paul is using these stories that left an indelible imprint in Timothy's life because he wants him to remember. Paul never threw in the towel. Paul never tapped out and gave up. Paul had been driven from persecution in Antioch, and so he uses these three, and they're kind of all captured for us in Acts. You can look in Acts chapter 13, and so, he's in Antioch, and he's forced out of Antioch, and then he kind of comes to Iconium, and then they plot to, kind of a lynch mob, and they just are out to kill him, literally. That's Acts 14. And then Timothy was in Lystra, kind of his hometown, where Paul is stoned. And you can hear the details captured for us in Acts 14. I have it ready to read it for you. Then some of the Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. Now, this is kind of interesting. It shows that the power of false teachers, that there were a few guys, you could say, in Antioch and Iconium who were out to kill Paul. They were deceptive. They were deceivers. And now they're following him. They force him out of this town, force him out of that town. Now they follow him. But they're so slick in what they do that everybody else begins to believe him or believe what they say, and then sooner or later they all got rocks. That's what's happening. So they stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up, went back into the city. The next day he and Barnabas left for Derbe. It's so crazy how it's kind of written here, about killed him, and then he dusted himself off, went right back into the city. Now, that's another thing that kind of blows my mind whenever I read this story here, that Paul is stoned. It's brutal. Everyone thought he's dead. Drag him out of the city. Somehow he's not. Again, it blows your mind. It's a miracle. He's, still alive. And then, I don't know about you, but if somebody had literally stoned me to death, the last place I'm going is back to the same city that nearly stoned me to death. And Paul says, Timothy, you remember that time? I didn't give up. I didn't run away. I stayed strong in the faith and strong on the mission that God had called me to do. Remembrance, continuance. Can you imagine the impact that this would have had on young Timothy's life? I mean, he's probably like, I can't do ministry if this is it, right? I think I would have gave up too. If this is being a pastor, I'm done, But he doesn't. And Paul says, remember what happened to me. I endured all of those persecutions, and yet the Lord rescued me from them all. Remember my faithfulness and follow me. I told my friend yesterday, who he then kind of closed, and he says, Paul, I want you to know that I've always wanted to be like you. And I'm like, what? No, you don't. I said, no, that's really what I've wanted to do. And I said, my goodness. I said, please, I hope that I can say this with honesty like the Apostle Paul would say. Don't follow me, but follow me as I follow Christ. And it's unreal. And I think Paul is kind of sharing this with Timothy. I need to follow me as I have followed Christ and been faithful to him. And then Paul continues on. He's like, Timothy, I want you to know, be encouraged. Remember these things, and remember those stories. They're going to help you kind of further you along in your mission. But I also want you to know that there are going to be evildoers that are going to come your way. I'm reminding you again about them false teachers that are going to come, and they're going to try to deceive you. It's going to get from bad to worse, and you need to be ready. And he goes, this is going to happen in these last days. It's inevitable. Another commentary this week, it's called Exalting Jesus in 2 Timothy. David Platt is one of the authors, and he says this. He says, instead of being surprised by opposition, we should be surprised when we do not face any. If we are not facing any opposition in our ministry, or I'm going to add in your life, chances are we are not living out our calling to the hilt. Of course, we do not look for opposition. We are not seeking enemies, but we must understand that opposition is inevitable for all who live godly lives. Some will experience physical oppression. Others will feel it in their hearts as they grieve over others' lives. Most will be ignored, mocked, or rejected. There was a phrase when I read it in this commentary, I had to read it 12 times. I'm like, what did he just say? And I highlighted it here for you. And he says, some will experience physical oppression, persecution. Others will feel it in their hearts as they grieve over others' lives. I never thought about it this way. What this author is saying, if he's accurate, is he's saying persecution isn't just physical. It's the ache you feel in your heart for a friend who's refusing to trust Jesus. Take it up a step. It's the ache you feel in your heart when your family doesn't trust Jesus. It's the ache you feel in your heart when your kids are saying, I don't want Jesus. It's that ache that this author is saying that you will feel that persecution in your hearts. Yesterday, again, as I interacted with many of these students, and I talked to one student, and I just kind of asked her, how's your brother doing? He used to come to youth group. How's he doing? And she paused, and I just knew it. She said, he's struggling. He's struggling. My heart aches because I know there's a better way. And that's the story of quite a few of our students through the years, that they hit a spot and they're struggling, right? And my heart aches. And so last night, my wife and I were talking, and we're just kind of thinking about all these memories, and literally we're taking that heavy weight, right? That's persecution. Right? I hurt over my friends and these students that we've invested hours and hours and years into their lives, and they don't have to be struggling. There's a better way. Persecution. You've experienced that ache before as well. Many of you are there. You know what it feels like. And I would encourage you, like Paul would encourage Timothy, never give up. Don't give up on your kids. Don't give up on your friends. Don't give up on your neighbors. You continue to keep the faith and stay strong. They'll see your example, and one day we pray that God will work a miracle, right? I just heard that Jeremiah's life. It just came to me. I just looked over and saw. He had I won't tell all the story, but we'll just say a family member called him out of the blue and said, guess what? I trusted Jesus, right? It was awesome, right? And it would like totally change his whole day that day. Probably changed his whole week. You know? Those are cool stories that we ache over those things. And Paul says, be prepared. Persecution will happen. 1 John chapter 3, John echoes Jesus' words, and he says, do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. Race car drivers should expect crashes. Football players are not surprised by injuries. Baseball players, they're going to get hit by the ball every now and then. Soldiers expect to get shot. Christians should expect some degree of persecution on some level. And Paul says, don't be surprised, Timothy. But as for you, he says, continue in what you have learned and have become convinced of, because you know those from whom you learned it, and how from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. So first there was remembrance, and then there was continuance. Timothy now had he'd remembered these things and all that he had been through together with Paul. He'd seen Paul's amazing example of how he kept the faith, and now he knows he's got to continue in these things he's learned. But Paul now kind of takes it a little bit of a step further, and he says, but wait, don't just remember the things you've learned from me, but think about the team that has helped bring you to where you are. We first started our series in chapter 1. We read this on the first week of our series. Paul says, I am reminded of your sincere faith, Timothy, which first lived in your grandma, Lois, and in your mama, Eunice. And I am persuaded now lives in you also. Paul was like a spiritual father to Timothy. He helped train and mentor him. He had poured into Timothy's life. He had spent countless hours investing into his life. But Paul knew that he wasn't the only one, that there was a faithful mom and a faithful grandma who never gave up on Paul and poured into his life. Continue in what you have learned. Today we're going to end a little bit differently. And I know it's like 11:57, and I'm going to ask the praise team to come up. Some of you you're mesmerized by the fact that I did a sermon in 33 minutes, and don't continue to hope that I'm tired in further Sundays. But anyways, here's the question I want to ask you. Who has been influential in your spiritual growth? And what I mean by that is, without them, you have no idea where you would be today. That's what I mean. That person or persons. Where would you be? There is something powerful about remembering. Paul knew it. He took us through this journey as he's sharing that with Timothy, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to remember, and then we're going to continue. We're going to remember all that they did for us, how they poured into our life, how they invested in us. We're going to remember how they kept the faith when things weren't always perfect, right? And then we're going to look at their example, and we're going to say, yeah, we too want to keep the faith. And so Paul was admitting that when we remember it, it fuels this continuance in the gospel. And so who have been some of those heroes of the faith? Maybe some of them have been some that have gone before us. Maybe they're still here. I'll share a few with you that I have. My dad. I observed my dad as a pastor for many, many years. And I'll tell you this, I promise you this, my dad never gave up. Was there times he was tempted to? Yeah. He never gave up. He was faithful and faithful to God's word, and that fueled his continuance. And that fuels me today. Because he was faithful in ministry, I can be faithful in ministry because he led me that example. My mom, still faithful in ministry. In fact, she's in ministry right now teaching our young kids today. This is her month, right? My mom, my wife, unbelievable. The things that I learned from her. My kids, there's reverse mentoring also where your younger kids can teach you things about life. My kids, 2 of them are on the stage here. I leaned over to my wife today during the last song and I said, we are blessed. We're blessed. My kids teach me about my relationship with God. Glenn Brookbank, some of you know him. If you do, you know him. 90-year-old man, poured into my life, never gave up on me. He's faithfulness. Lonnie Miller, some of you know him. Greatest evangelist I know. Lonnie has never given up. And he won't give up on you. He'll pursue you because he knows that Christ is pursuing you. It's those faithful men and women in my life that have allowed me to continue on in ministry. Who's it been for you?